Today we're going to be looking at notes number 2 for Unit 1, Forms of Government in Today's World. So remember, in the book, it is Chapter 1, Lesson 2.2. So in the book, you'll find it under Unit 1, Lesson 2, pages 25 through 31. This whole unit, we're focusing on comparing forms of government, and our essential question is, how should political and economic power be distributed in a society? So today we'll be looking at several forms of government to give you different ideas of just how countries around the world have organized their power in government. Our objective for this set of notes is to analyze the advantages and disadvantages of various political systems and compare the ways in which power is distributed in systems of shared power. All right, so we're starting on page 25, Forms of Government in Today's World. As Aristotle observed more than 2,000 years ago, these governments fall into three broad groups. Rule by one, so monarchies, dictatorship, one person controlling everything. Rule by the few, theocracies, single party states where you have an elite group of people that make decisions. And rule by the many, parliamentary and presidential democracies. So our government in the US would fall under the last, rule by the many, because we have a presidential democracy. For monarchical governments to have survived for 1,000 years, it must have enduring attractions. At the same time, monarchical governments have its drawback. Most monarchs today face rigid legal restrictions on their power, often imposed by a constitution. So we still see lots of countries around the world have kings or queens. You have Great Britain, King Charles just took over. You have think like Sweden, Denmark, Monaco, Spain. You still have lots of countries with monarchies. However, most of them have kind of evolved to constitutional monarchies. They're not absolute. And sometimes people just kind of like that tradition of having that figurehead, that ruler for their country. They don't want to necessarily make big changes. So forms of government in today's world continued. Whereas monarchs inherit their power, dictators take and hold power by force. Dictatorships share some characteristics of absolute monarchies. Dictatorships face serious legitimacy problems, which is why they have this totalitarian hold over their people and their country, controlling the news media, what people read, what people listen to, what information people have access to. They try not to allow for, or I should say, they don't allow for any dissension or challenges to their power. A theocracy is a government headed by a religious leader. And so where the religion creates the laws of the state. So by 2018, only 2 theocracies existed in the world. Vatican City, very small within Italy, within the city of Rome, where the Pope is basically in charge, and Iran. And so with Iran, you have kind of more of a strict guidelines where their religion creates the laws of what the people have to follow. Forms of government in today's world continued. In a single party state, the Constitution allows only one political party to govern. Ideally, a single party system avoids much of the political wrangling that is common in multi party states, making it easier to pass laws and implement government policy. This party unity comes at a cost, however. So, when you think about a single party state, we're talking something like China. So, only the Communist Party gets to make decisions, and everyone kind of has to go along with it. So with a single party system, you are allowing one party to make decisions for the whole country. In the modern world, no country is governed as a pure direct democracy. Limited forms of direct democracy exist in the United States. Most nations today have adopted 1 or 2 forms of representative democracy, either parliamentary or presidential. The United Kingdom, India, and Austria are examples of parliamentary democracy. In a parliamentary democracy, voters elect lawmakers to represent them in the nation's parliament. And so the backdrop of our slideshow today shows Theresa May. She's a former prime minister for Great Britain. So the legislative majority within Parliament selects a member of Parliament to serve as the nation's prime minister or chief executive. In a parliamentary democracy, there is no clear-cut separation between the executive and legislative branches of government, and prime ministers remain in power only so long as they have the support of Parliament. So you may remember in the summertime, Boris Johnson was the prime minister of Great Britain, but he lost support of Parliament. He was going to probably be ousted, and so he chose to resign, and Parliament kind of took a while to finally elect someone new. And then once they did, they had chosen, and her name, I can't think of it right now. They had picked a new prime minister. It was a woman. And the Queen of England met her at the beginning of the week. And then by the end of the week, the Queen had passed away. And then within, I think, 45 days, that prime minister lost power, lost support of Parliament, and then Parliament elected someone new. So there was a new prime minister in Great Britain. So this graph is in the textbook, shows you kind of the differences between a parliamentary democracy. So the biggest difference is, again, we have voters. So voters in a parliamentary democracy, they elect their representatives. Like in England, they're called members of parliament. But then the members of parliament, they choose the prime minister. Whereas here in the United States, we, the voters, get to elect the president, and we get to elect our representatives in the House and our senators. And so that is kind of the biggest difference. So the voters, I guess you would say, have more of a say with a presidential democracy because we're electing both independently of each other. We have a presidential election, we have an election for our representatives. And here's the last slide for today's notes. So the United States, Indonesia, and most countries in Latin America are presidential democracies. This system has some advantages over a parliamentary democracy. This system does have several disadvantages when compared to the parliamentary one. So I would think the advantages is people having more of a say in who they are being elected. They're being directly elected by the people, makes them more responsive to the public than their party. And they enjoy more legitimacy and public support than a prime minister would. And then sometimes, though, the disadvantages, it's really difficult to remove a president from power. I had given you the examples of the prime minister when they lost support. It's a little bit easier to kind of make those changes within the government. So that's the end of the notes. You want to make sure you go back, use the textbook, use the TCI tab to finish your key terms for this section.